I would say consciousness is not tangible. Once upon a time, I co-hosted a podcast. I was the atheist, and there was a friend of mine who was an evangelical type of Christian. He's a minister now, in fact. We would always have these debates, and so we said, well, let's do a podcast. It was fun for a while, but my argument with him oftentimes was he would talk about souls and spirit, and I would always ask him, what's that made out of? Well, I feel silly having asked him that now, because now you're asking me, okay, well, what's that made out of? What's information made of? And I'm like, it's tricky. But, you know, I see a number of things differently now. Where consciousness lands in my framework is, it's not fundamental in the way that the consciousness is primary philosophy camp sees it, where somehow underlying it all must be a consciousness. I get why they arrive at that, and that's because they're trying to make it make sense against the backdrop of materialism. And it doesn't resolve. Materialism by itself doesn't work. There are too many anomalies. There are too many things that should not be possible if it's all particles and gravity and space-time and energy that are possible. And we've gotten to the point, even mainstream science largely has gotten to the point where it can't pretend that those things are not happening, pretend that those things are not real. We're at a point in time right now where it looks like the United States government is essentially going to say UFOs are real, and something along the lines of, we don't know where they're from, we don't know who they are, we don't know what they want, we don't know how they work. If you've paid attention to that field of inquiry over the last, 20 years anyway, we have a body of information that says how they work, or it says what they do. And none of that works in the model of the universe that mainstream physics currently provides. Where the way I look at it probably does harmonize with, the school of thought that consciousness is fundamental, is if you look at something like a near-death experience, right? Which I used to just completely discount. The brain does something that, we don't understand. We don't understand a lot of things inside brains. They're wrapped in skulls. And at a point when they're no longer wrapped in skulls, they're usually not doing anything. If you look at an NDE informationally instead of physically, what that starts to look like is, okay, start with remote viewing. And I've been studying remote viewing for a number of years. I've trained with well-known folks in that field, Laurie Williams, Paul Smith, and others. And if you look at what that is my ability, or anyone's, to access information which current physics models do not allow for. I did one the other day, and the target was, a number. I wrote the number down. I started describing it. Structure, tall, white, shiny, reflective. I then moved inside. I described the carpet. Now, the whole time I thought it was a casino. As soon as I saw what the environment was like, which was fairly dry and warm, and what I perceived was that it was surrounded by openness. So right off the bat, I'm like, okay, well, it's a federal building or a courthouse. It's some ornate structure of that kind in an area that's dry and hot and open. So my brain starts to put it in Las Vegas. Well, then I go inside and I actually drew a design that was on the carpet. It wasn't a perfect match for what it ended up being on the carpet, but it was that kind of carpet. And I knew when I was drawing it that it was the carpet. And immediately my brain goes, that's a casino. In remote viewing, you make notations of those things, and we kind of consider them to be intrusions, but that's the analytical part of your brain doing its job. You cannot make your brain stop. By virtue of your brain not stopping, what that means is it's in the way of this function to a certain extent. You couldn't do this without your brain, but your brain is also working against you the whole time. Now, fortunately for me, the goal of remote viewing is not for me to identify what the target is. It's just for me to describe the target. If you look at an NDE, what that looks like to me is your consciousness without your brain in the way. Because we've got a machine beeping over here. It was beeping short, fast beeps, and now it's a long beep. That says that the brain's not doing anything. And yet people come back from that. It's a high percentage of the time that happens. People come back with something to report. There's been myriad studies on this. And frankly, for my role in all this, I'm past the point of trying to convince science that certain things are real. That's not my job anymore. And there's a whole 2-3 generations of folks who have just spent their whole experimental scientific career just trying to gather a body of evidence that is irrefutable. And in my opinion, that's done already. Pim van Lommel literally wrote the book on near-death experiences, and he and I have spoken about it, and he has said that he thinks my framework, provides something explanatory to this. But it looks to me like that means consciousness in my framework is an informational structure capable of existing without the brain. Now, I do not extrapolate that to mean that all brains do is channel existing consciousness or souls and past lives. I don't get into all that. I don't see any evidence for it. But what I do see a good body of evidence for is that consciousness, it seems to me that consciousness comes from a variety of processes in the brain, feedback mechanisms and processing and storage. Informationally, that does seem to in some way transcend physical existence, at least for a time. I don't know what happens after the near-death experience, if it becomes a total death experience. I don't know. We haven't had anybody back to report on that yet. But it looks like, at least for a period of time anyway, without the brain in the way, what you end up with is, like what we call in remote viewing, an extremely wide aperture arrangement between the conscious perception ability of the person and what my framework sees as the informational substrate. It's the ultimate informational substrate access. So yeah, I don't think it's unreasonable at all. You could say that consciousness lives on past the life of the brain. You could also, if you wanted to go that far, I don't, but you could go so far as to say perhaps all of our concepts of afterlife and eternity and being kind of in communion, people come back and say they knew everything for a few minutes. That all of a sudden makes sense if there's an informational substrate that isn't physical in the way we understand it. All of that stuff starts to be a lot less counterintuitive to what we're trained. I've never had an NDE. Been in a couple of car accidents, but they weren't that serious.